Okay, I think we're recording. Keith, can you talk into the microphone, please?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. I've got the cans on.
Cool.
Because I'm trying to make sure the recording is up to scratch.
Nice.
Even though I have no idea what I'm doing half the time. I just turn on Adobe Audition, press record, and hope it works out. And then I just pass it on to Regina, or the podcast producer, and hope it sounds good later, folks.
Well, you look the part now. You have the headphones on. You've got the pop shield. Got the mic.
Hell yeah, dude.
Yeah.
I'm ready to rock and roll for today's episode, which it's a spooky episode today, folks. We haven't done a spooky episode of the That Chapter podcast in it's been a minute. But we will get into it. Yeah, we got a good one today. It's a one we want to do for quite some time. Today we have the story of the Hex House Murder.
Yeah, I'm so excited to get into this.
Me too. This is a really, really good one. I have to say, obviously I've been doing that chapter. I started in 2017. Can you believe that? I've been doing it for like 8 years.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, which is a long ass time. But my favorite stories.
Hopefully one of these days kicks off.
Yeah. Hey, listen, here's hoping, fingers crossed. But my favorite stories, even after all these years later, are the creepy ones. The spookiest ones are my favorite stories to tell. And this is that episode. Before we get into it though, we have our usual little tidbits.
Yep.
Tidbit number 1, Mike's movie reviews. Hollywood Mike is back again with Mike's Movie Hour.
Okay.
Today's movie I have reviewed for you folks. I know you guys are only chomping at the bit to hear about my thoughts, my eloquent thoughts about the movie is The Damned.
Oh, yeah.
Released in 2025. I think it's actually just fresh out.
Yeah.
It was just fresh out on Apple Movies or Apple TV or whatever. Because I just watched it like 2 days ago. Yeah, it's good. So it's a movie. It's kind of set in the 1800s sometime. It's never said the exact year, and it's never said where exactly it is, but it's in this frozen fishing port. It's in the depths of winter in this remote fishing port and icy mountains and stuff. The characters in the movie, they speak in English, like there's a lot of they're English actors, but they all have kind of like Norse names, so I presume it's maybe supposed to be somewhere in Norway or something.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, so the basic premise of the movie is it's this very remote fishing port. They're there for the winter, but it's not going so well. They're not catching very many fish. And then they see this ship, it sinks near them. Okay. And, they're like, oh, should we go out and rescue these people? At the end, though, they find some supplies. So it kind of seems like they go out there to salvage what they can from the ship. But of course, shit goes wrong. Ooh. And then there's a Draugr, which is a Draugr. It's like an undead zombie.
Oh, okay,
cool. Kind of starts stalking them in this fishing port. But of course, maybe not everything is as it seems. Ooh. I really enjoyed it. I don't really want to say much more than that. Yeah. It's kind of it's a low budget. I would say it's kind of an indie movie. Yeah. But it was 90 minutes. It's a tight 90. Yeah. You know my thoughts on movie lengths. It's a tight 90 minutes, and that was immediately the most appealing thing to me about it. But it's a very visually pretty movie. The acting is good. I thought the plot, my estimation of the plot went up and down as the movie went on, but it ended actually on a high. Okay. I really liked kind of towards the end, a little bit, not a spoiler, but things kind of get revealed, and I actually thought it was done really, really well. Yeah, honestly, good movie. As I said, it's sort of an indie movie. There's nobody I really recognized in it. Yeah. The Hound from Game of Thrones was the only character.
Big lad, isn't
it? Yeah, that's the big lad. He never watched Game of Thrones.
No, I didn't.
No, you kind of saved yourself. You saved yourself 5 seasons of probably like one of the best written shows of all time, and like 3 seasons of pure shite.
Do you know what? Like, because I never read the books, so I didn't get into it that way. And when I seen the trailers for Game of Thrones, I was like, oh, excellent. This is going to be like a Lord of the Rings type sort of movie. And then I started like a couple episodes, like, this is nothing like Lord of the Rings. Yeah. I don't like this at all.
There's titties in this. I'm not watching it.
I think it's just my expectations were, this is Lord of the Rings. And then I got into it. I was like, no, it's not. So then it kind of turned me off. And then I just never got back into it. Yeah. But I'm glad it didn't, because from what I heard at the end, it was a bummer.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And are you happy with how things ended? Yeah.
So anyway, that's today's the latest movie review, The Damned. Yeah, folks, I would give it a watch, and I would probably watch it again. So
yeah, I'm glad it sounds good, because when I seen the trailer for it, I was buzzing to watch it.
Yeah,
it gave me kind of like the vibe and like the aesthetics of the movie was kind of nearly, like Robert Edgar's, that sort of witchy. It looked really
the poster of the movie really reminded me of like that mixed with like Longlegs. Regina showed me a trailer for it like a couple months ago, and I'd been excited to see it as well. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it as good as like a Robert Eggers movie, but I thought it was very well worth a watch. I'd give it a 4 out of 5.
Nice, okay, that's high.
It is, maybe too high. I need to rethink this. Actually, I'm just realizing my movie ranks are incredibly arbitrary. But you know what, Keith? I will say, today's story, 10 out of 10.
Absolutely, this is a great story.
All right, folks. Well, today it is the story of the Hex House murder. You know, the idea of witchcraft and hexes usually belongs in campfire tales told in a remote forest, or maybe a true crime podcast that just loves some spooky shit, of course.
Yeah, why not?
But in the early 20th century Pennsylvania, folk magic known as pow-wowing was still very much a part of daily life. Now, pow-wowing, it was a blend of old German healing traditions, religious prayers, and the occasional spell to ward off evil. Most of the time, it was harmless. Until it was not. Which is where today's story takes us to. It was basically kind of like white magic, you might call it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It was like the good witches of ye old times.
Ye olden times. Exactly. So what started as a man convinced he was hexed quickly spiraled into one of the strangest murder cases in American history. A trio of superstitious men set out to break a supposed curse. But by the time their mission ended, a man was dead, a community was in shock, and the entire country was buzzing about the so-called York witchcraft murder. The case ignited a full-blown moral panic, turning powwowers into suspected criminals and casting a long shadow over Pennsylvania's folk magic traditions. So, was it really a case of witchcraft gone wrong, or just paranoia leading to a brutal crime? Either way, it's a tale of superstition, fear, and some truly bizarre twists. So buckle up, because this story is truly wilder than fiction. And now, let's give it a go.
Now, before we get into today's story, I think it's worth talking about what exactly pow-wowing is.
Please do, Keith.
I think to really understand how a belief in magic could drive someone to murder, you have to just see how deeply woven it was into, everyday life. So Pennsylvania wasn't just a melting pot of different cultures, it was also a spiritual free-for-all when it was founded in 1681 by William Penn, a Quaker who envisioned a colony where people of all faiths could worship freely. Among those who took advantage of this opportunity were the Pennsylvania Dutch, who, despite their name, they weren't actually Dutch. They were German. It comes from, the German for Deutschland, Deutsch, yeah. So these German-speaking immigrants brought with them a unique blend of Christianity and old world folk magic, a tradition stretching back to medieval Europe. Now, Germany has its own long and bloody history with witchcraft. I'm sure our old pal Henrik Kramer.
Our boy Henrik, friend of the pod.
So the guy who literally wrote the book on hunting witches, Malleus Maleficarum, he spent a good chunk of the 15th century scouring the Rhine Valley near the Black Forest for people to burn.
Hey, you gotta find them.
Right, the Black Forest is awesome. Have you seen photos of it? It's where all where all those stories come from, like Hansel and Gretel.
Oh, like Grimm's fairy tales and stuff?
Yeah, it's
the
really
Black Forest. I mean, it sounds like hell yeah.
Yeah.
It does look creepy and cool. It's kind of like when you think of like a creepy Germanic forest.
That's exactly.
It's literally what it is. Yeah, you can imagine the witch living in a house there on chicken legs or whatever, right, that kind of stuff. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. So many Pennsylvania Dutch immigrants, they came from the very region, carrying both the memory of the hysteria caused by Henrik Kramer and for folk traditions their ancestors had passed down for generations. So in the New World, these settlers, they blended old world magic with Christian beliefs, creating a unique tradition called Brauerei, later known as pow-wowing. So pow-wowers, they believed their power came from God, and their practices, they often looked like a mix of Christian prayers, biblical verses, and old Germanic charms. A good pow-wower, he could heal the sick, break curses, locate lost objects, and even predict the future. Ooh. So people, they sought him out for everything from curing an illness to protecting their livestock from misfortune. The plain Dutch, though, like the Amish, they rejected pow-wowing. But for many others, it was an accepted part of life. But as with any practice that dabbles in the mystical, there was always whispers of something darker. While most pow-wowers claimed to draw power from God, others were accused of practicing hexerai, the German word for witchcraft.
Oh, hexerai. That actually sounds so much cooler than witchcraft.
Doesn't it?
Well, hexerai?
I'm going to tell you
that
hexerai
rocks.
in the future.
Hexerai!
Hexerai! So some were even called hex doctors, though this term, it's a bit of a grey area. It could refer to pow-wowers who understood the workings of hexerai, purely just to combat it. You need to know who you're fighting.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also used to describe those who were believed to cross the line into full-blown witchcraft. These individuals were said to invoke the devil or use their abilities to curse rather than to heal. Now, even though there was this ongoing battle between pow-wowers and witches, good versus bad, in a deeply superstitious community, the line between healer and witch, it was razor thin. So if a pow-wower's charm didn't work, if a neighbour's bad luck, it just lingered on a bit too long, suspicion could turn dangerous. Pow-wowers often saw themselves as protectors against witches, but they often found themselves accused of being witches too, just as often.
The very thing you were supposed to fight against.
Right!
I love this.
So that fear, the idea that someone's misfortune could be traced back to an invisible curse, a hex, was powerful enough to drive men to murder.
And now let's talk about the central character in today's story, John Blymire. So now that we've got a bit of a background on pow-wowing, where it came from, how it worked, let's jump ahead to the year 1928 in York County, Pennsylvania. Just for a general idea, this is like in middle of Pennsylvania. It's not near Pittsburgh, it's not near Philly. It's kind of like in the middle of nowhere, close to the Maryland border. So at the center of this chilling tale is John Blymire, a man whose deep belief in hexes would set a deadly chain of events into motion. But his obsession with curses and dark forces, it didn't start overnight. He'd been born into a family steeped in pow-wowing. Both his father and grandfather were known healers. But despite his lineage, life never seemed to go his way. As a child, he was often sickly and weak, something his parents believed was caused by a hex. As he grew older, his misfortunes only continued. Jobs slipped through his fingers, 2 of his 3 children died, and his marriage shaky at best. He became convinced that unseen forces were working against him. He became certain that a witch's hex was behind his endless bad luck, and that thought, it consumed him. His paranoia spiraled until he could barely sleep or function. Eventually, his declining mental state began to draw a bit of attention. His sanity was examined at the York County home, and he was committed to the state hospital for the mentally ill, where doctors diagnosed him with witchcraft delusions. I love that. Witchcraft delusions.
Yeah, I think I have that.
Yeah, I think you do. However, after just 48 days, Blymire simply walked out of the hospital. Technically, he wasn't supposed to leave. He had been committed by a court order, but for whatever reason, simply nobody came after him. Nobody stopped him. Oh, there's somebody do something.
Yeah.
Oh.
You just walk. No, come back.
He's gone too far.
He's too far.
When he got home, things didn't magically get better, pun intended.
Nice.
His paranoia only made his marriage worse, leading to constant fights with his wife. Eventually, she had had enough, and she divorced him. Desperate for answers, Blymire turned to powwow doctors, explaining his symptoms and his belief that he was hexed. And, wouldn't you know it, every single one of these powwow doctors agreed, after taking his money of course, only fueling his paranoia further. Then came the visit that changed everything. A powwower named Emma Knopp, better known as Nellie Null or the River Witch, lived in Marietta, Lancaster County. And depending on who you asked, she might actually have been just a straight-up witch, and she certainly looked like a straight-up witch. She was around 70 years old, barely 5.5 feet tall, and her most striking feature was a single, long, sharp tooth. The only one left in her upper jaw, jutting out from the right side of her mouth. I mean, yeah, she sounds like the stereotypical old woman witch. She sounds kind of cool.
I mean, she's wearing the uniform.
yeah. Blymire had met Nellie before, so she already knew about all his troubles. But on his 3rd or 4th visit, she decided it's time to reveal the truth, Blymire. She took a $1 bill, placed it on the palm of John Blymire's left hand, and muttered a magic incantation. Focus all your thoughts on the bill, she instructed. When I lift it, you will see the face of the man who hexed you. Blymire, he did as he was told, and when Nellie finally lifted the bill, his blood ran cold. He saw a face he recognized. Nelson Rehmeyer. Nellie shrieked, "This is the man! This is the man who has hexed you!" And just like that, John's paranoia had a target. A person to finally blame for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Blymire was taken aback. He had known Nelson Rehmeyer his entire life. When Blymire was 5, Nelson had powwowed for him, curing an ailment that even his father and grandfather couldn't fix. At 10, he had worked on Nelson's farm, picking potatoes for 25 cents a day. But if the River Witch said Nelson was the one who had hexed him, then, well, old River Witch wouldn't lie. Right. It has to be true.
Yeah.
This man he had grown up with, who he'd worked with, was secretly an evil witch, cursing his entire life.
Oh my God.
He's the devil. Now, Nellie didn't just expose the culprit, she also gave Blymire the formula to break the curse that had been cast upon him. To rid himself of the hex, he needed to get a lock of Nelson's hair, take his copy of the Long Lost Friend book, and bury them both 6 feet underground. Sounds simple enough, straightforward enough. The only problem was that Nelson was a big, strong fella, and he was also a witch, an evil, dark witch, right. It also sounds like. So John was going to need some help.
The book you mentioned, The Long Lost Friend, it's an interesting book. So it's part spell book, part good luck charm, and it was a must-have for any pow-wower or hex doctor. So Pennsylvania Germans, they were big on charms, which were usually written on paper and carried for protection. If they weren't kept on you, they'd be hung up in a house or in a barn. Everyday objects, they could also be turned into magical tools, things like coins, nails, or even string, and these were used to absorb bad luck or illnesses. And once the bad energy was transferred, the object, it would just be tossed or it would be buried, and that would just simply break the spell. So for generations, pow-wowers, they kept handwritten books filled with like family spells, kind of like recipes passed down after generation.
Damn, I would much rather freaking spells though than recipes. That sounds awesome.
These are remedies instead of recipes.
Yeah.
But by the mid-1800s, printed versions, they started to circulate. The most famous of these was Der lang verbonging Freund. I've butchered that, but it translates to The Long Lost Friend. So this was written in 1819 by John George Homan, a German immigrant living in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It was packed with spells, prayers, folk medicine, and it quickly became the go-to guide for pow-wowers. Now, a big selling point for this book was also that the book itself was believed to have magical power. People swore up and down that just owning a copy would protect them from fire, drowning, weapons, and even unfair punishment. Sure, every edition even had its own little guarantee in the front, basically saying, carry this book and nothing bad can happen to you. So beyond that, it had spells for all sorts of things. Stopping thieves, keeping witches away, healing livestock, and even curing rabid animals. If you were into pow-wowing, The Long Lost Friend, it wasn't just a handy guide, it was an essential piece to your toolkit. So it was a pretty safe bet that Nelson had a copy when Nellie told John what he needed to do. He needed to grab his copy and needed to bury it. Now, The Long Lost Friend, this wasn't the only book floating around the powwow community. There was another one, a far more sinister, with a reputation for being downright dangerous. The 6th and 7th book of Moses.
Ooh, now we're talking.
Right. So unlike The Long Lost Friend, which was mostly about healing or protection, this book was all about conjuring spells, controlling demons, and even recreating biblical plagues of Egypt. Some copies were even rumoured to have been written in blood. All right, that's cool.
Oh, yes. Yes, baby.
So it had a dark reputation, and while it didn't play a huge role in what happened next, I still feel it's worth mentioning because John Blymire, he was very, very familiar with it. In fact, later on, investigators, they would find notes in his room taken directly from its pages. It's mad that John, he was really, he was obviously into powwowing because of his family, but he was also really deeply involved in also the darker side of things.
Yeah, the spookier, kind of almost like black magic's side of sort of.
And he'd go with people who were said to be part of this black magic, like the River Witch. People were said she's a powerful power, and there was rumors that she was into black magic, and he was trying to lift this curse by going to people. It just didn't make a lot of sense.
I'm just looking now. I found a copy of The Long Lost Friend. You can find a PDF of it almost instantly. It's basically though prayers to say when you're feeling whatever. It gives you a list of all these sort of prayers to say, and then it's just old wives kind of remedies, for a toothache, for colic. Here you go. To destroy warts, for example, roast chicken feet and rub the warts with them, then bury them under the eaves, A good remedy to stop bleeding. This is the day on which the injury happened. Blood then was stop until the Virgin Mary bring forth another son. Repeat these words 3 times.
Right.
Okay.
I guess that's the mix of the biblical part with the folk magic part.
Folk magic, yeah. It's basically just these old folk remedies.
Just get a bandage.
Here you go. Cure for the epilepsy. Take a turtle dove, cut its throat, and let the person afflicted with epilepsy drink the blood.
Oh.
Okay, so that's a little bit kind of dark. You're sacrificing an animal. Okay, now we're talking.
What's good for the epilepsy isn't good for the dove.
There you go. Okay, a good cure for wounds. Take the bones of a calf and burn them until they turn to powder, and then strewn it into the wound. This powder prevents the flesh from putrefying and is therefore of great importance to healing the wound. To make good beer, take a handful of hops, 5 or 6 gallons of water, about 3 tablespoons of ginger, half a gallon of molasses, filter the water, hops, and ginger into the tub containing the molasses. I mean, yeah.
3 ginger. What was the part? What was it?
Yeah, some of these are just pretty. It's kind of interesting though. Well, folks, there you go. Just Google and you'll find a PDF of it.
Yeah, there's nothing too dark about it.
Nothing too. Although there was animal sacrifice.
Well, yeah,
I kind of dug.
That's true. That's
Maybe
true.
a bit more of that, folks, next time. Whenever you're writing it next time, whatever your name is, John Holman, get your shit together. All right, though. Now we move on. John Blymire needed help if he's going to take on the witch Nelson Rehmeyer. Now, even though John Blymire was getting hexed every which way, he was getting hexed up the wazoo, he still had bills to pay. So during this time, he managed to land a job as a cigar maker. And that's where he met 14-year-old John Curry. Despite the age gap, the two hit it off, bonding over their shared experience of having a pretty rough life. Curry, for one, was 14 and working in a cigar factory, so things weren't exactly going John Curry's way.
Right, yeah.
Not exactly the best. His childhood had been tough. His father died when he was 6, and his mother remarried a drunk named McLean, who was home way too much and made Curry's life miserable. At 13, desperate to escape, he used his large farm boy frame to sneak his way into the army. It didn't take long for them to figure out he was underage though, and he was promptly discharged. By the summer of 1928, he was back in York, working at the cigar factory. For Curry, Blymire became the father figure he never had. And for Blymire, he finally found someone who looked up to him and hung on his every word. Another young fella Blymire befriended around this time was 17-year-old Wilbert Hess. Hess grew up on what was once a thriving farm outside of York, but by 1926, things started going downhill, and fast. The crops had failed, the chickens stopped laying, and the cows quit giving milk. The Hess family didn't need to guess what was happening. They knew what was happening to their farm. It was obvious. They'd been hexed.
Of course.
Again. Like Blymire, they'd spent years trying to figure out who was behind the hex of the Hess farm, but nothing they did seemed to help. By 1928, things had gotten so bad that Hess's father, Milton, had to sell off most of their land just to stay afloat. With the farm barely hanging on, Hess and his dad took jobs driving trucks for the Pennsylvania Tool Company in downtown York. And, as fate would have it, the company garage was right across the alley from the rooming house where John Blymire lived. And so it didn't take long for the two, John Blymire and young Wilbert Hess to strike up a friendship. And before Hess knew it, he was confiding in Blymire about the hex that had wrecked his family's life. And Blymire said, well, guess what? My whole own fat life has been destroyed by hexes. Maybe we should team up. Luckily for both Curry and Hess, John knew exactly who to turn to for answers. Let's go, guys. Another quick visit to the River Witch. And $5 later, who would have thunk it? What are the odds? Nelson Rehmeyer was cursing all of them. He's behind all of their problems, this one fella. Jeez, he's the most evilest lad around.
She's like, who did I say last time? Yeah, him.
Yeah, he's at it again. Blymire convinced the other two that breaking the hex was simple. All they had to do was get a lock of Nelson's hair, steal his book, The Long Lost Friend, and bury them both 6 feet underground. And so, with that, the witch hunt was on.
So who exactly was this Nelson Rehmeyer fella that we've been talking about so much? Nelson, he lived in Rehmeyer's Hollow, later known as Hex Hollow,
Dun dun.
Dun dun, a secluded area in York County, Pennsylvania, near Winterstown. The Rehmeyer family had been settling in the Hollow since 1844, and by the time our story takes place, Nelson, he'd carved out a life for himself on the small farm. The land, it was simple but functional. A few acres of woods, a large cleared patch where he grew potatoes and corn, and a small barn for his cows, horses, and a couple little chickens pecking around. But most notable thing about Nelson wasn't his farm. It was him. He was a big, eccentric guy, well over 6 feet tall, and he was built like an ox. He was a big fellow.
Built like a brick shithouse.
Exactly. He also had a reputation. Nelson was a well-known pow-wower, a man people sought out for their healing and protection. Nelson, he was married, but for the past 4 years, he and his wife, Alice, had been living separate lives. She basically had enough of his obsession with powwowing. The strange ceremonies, the incantations, the people constantly coming over. One day she just packed up and left, taking her 2 daughters to live on her parents' farm several miles away. And here it was at Hex Hollow that John Blymire and his band of unlucky souls kicked off their witch hunting crusade.
So Blymire and Curry decided it was time for reconnaissance, some looky-loos, covert-like.
Let's see what we're dealing with here.
On November 26, 1928, they stopped by the home of Nelson Rehmeyer's estranged wife, Alice, and asked where could they find him. She told them that, as far as she knew, he was at his house about a mile deeper into the hollow. Then, offhandedly, she referred to him as a devilish old witch. Now, she may have meant this as nothing more than a bitter remark pissed off at him, but to Blymire, it was confirmation. His suspicions, they were correct. Rehmeyer was dangerous. And so they ventured further into the woods, finally reaching his old colonial-style house on the edge of the woods. It was a tall house, and if you look at pictures of it, because it still stands to this day, it looks like a witch's house. For one, it's black. All of it. Narrow, yet tall, and it oozes dark deeds and closed shutters. A house which, if you saw it at twilight on a cold January day, you would best keep walking. When they reached his door, Blymire knocked. The moment Nelson stepped into view, Blymire hesitated. He was bigger and far more imposing than he had remembered, but it was too late to turn back. They followed him inside, making small talk about the long-lost friend and powwowing, careful not to reveal their true intentions. As the night stretched on, Nelson offered to let them sleep downstairs. They agreed. Once he was snoring, they crept throughout the house, searching for the long-lost friend. No luck. They did consider snipping a lock of his hair, but quickly realized there was no way they could hold him down long enough to do it. And it's not like they could simply ask him for his hair. This man, a friend to their faces, was secretly bewitching them and had been for years. He was destroying their lives. A secret devil, to be sure, who took great relish in causing misfortune to those around him. By morning, they knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed backup. On the night of November 27th, the following night, Blymire, Curry, and their new accomplice, Wilbert Hess, they returned to Hex Hollow, determined to finish what they had started. They reached Nelson's house just before midnight, trudging through the dead woods and frozen wind, and pounded on his door. From upstairs, his voice rang out. "Who's there?" "It's me, Blymire. I left my book behind," he called back, making up a flimsy excuse. And that was all it took. Moments later, Nelson opened the door, and he sealed his fate. The second his back was turned, they attacked him. They attacked the devil, Nelson Rehmeyer. The three of them tackled him to the floor, struggling to tie his legs with a rope. But Nelson was stronger than they had imagined, thrashing like a man possessed. Maybe he was. Blymire wrapped a length of rope around his throat and pulled. Hard. But even as the air left his lungs, Nelson fought. Curry panicked. He ran outside and grabbed a heavy chunk of wood and came back swinging. He brought it down on Nelson's skull again and again while the others stomped on him, beat him with their fists, even smashed a chair over his head. They tightened the rope around his neck. And Nelson finally stopped struggling. Breathing heavily, they stared down at the body. His face was unrecognizable. His skull caved in.
Depending on who you asked about this incident, went on from between a couple of minutes to like an hour.
Wow, an hour, yeah. That's
so
a long time to be dying. With Nelson dead, the hex was finally broken. There was no need now for the book or the lock of hair. And so, to cover their tracks, they grabbed whatever money they could find, ransacking the house to make it look like a robbery. Then, just to be sure, they doused his body in kerosene, struck a match, and watched the flames rise. As they slipped away into the night, they expected the fire to devour the house, along with any possible evidence of their murder. Now their lives will be better. There ain't no witch casting spells on them. That we know for sure. It's happy days here on.
Right?
Not quite so. See, 2 days later, a neighbor discovered Nelson's body. The fire had gone out. The room was untouched. The house stood unharmed. Nelson's corpse, though slightly charred, was largely intact, and it still laid sprawled there on the floor. It was as if some devilry had stopped the flames taking root, so their evil crime would be exposed.
Ooh. There are theories about this. So some say that he was still alive when he set him on fire, it's struggling just enough to extinguish the flames, but he only then succumbed to his injuries moments later. Others, they whisper of witchcraft, of a Pow-wowing's final act of defiance, a protective spell that refused to let the fire do its work. In one of the later confessions though, Curry, he admitted that they'd doused everything with water before lighting the match, hoping to wash away fingerprints, so that was probably it. Maybe.
Maybe. They doused everything with kerosene. Oh wait, no shit, wash away the kerosene.
Yeah. That's evidence.
Yeah. So in the end, it didn't really matter. See, Alice Rehmeyer, his estranged wife, she wasted no time in telling the police about Blymire and Curry's visit just a couple of days before. The suspects were arrested so quickly that news of their capture appeared in the same edition of the paper as the report of the actual murder. During an all-night interrogation, the men readily confessed. Blymire, oddly enough, he seemed more relieved than remorseful, though. After all, the hex was lifted. Yep, life is so much better now that you're being charged with murder. Yeah. All my problems are solved.
My string of bad luck has come to an end.
So the trials of the three men began on January 7th, 1929, with John Blymire going first. His case lasted just 3 days. The judge tried to keep any mention of witchcraft out of the courtroom, insisting that this was a simple robbery gone wrong. But when Wilbert Hess's brother slipped up on the stand and said the word witch, the floodgates opened. Blymire's lawyer, seeing an opportunity, argued that his client wasn't the criminal, but a deeply deluded man who truly believed in hexes and witchcraft. He painted Blymire as a man trapped in a life of misery, haunted by shadows, and incapable of knowing right from wrong. The jury, though, they didn't buy it. Blymire was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
I think it's worth noting that the use of the word witch also gave the press a field day. So with articles about witchcraft and black magic and powwowing gripping the public's attention, the case, it was completely sensationalized as the first witchcraft trial in 200 years since Salem. Got it in there.
You got it in there. Yes, snuck in Salem.
But these were the articles that they were putting out, and because before that, the judge, he had warned the press that he didn't want a mockery made of his courtroom. So he was like, we need to keep out all this nonsense of witchcraft and powwowing and all this stuff. Straight in line, this is a simple robbery. So when this all came out and they brought in the word witch, they're like, that's it, we can say it.
Yeah.
And they went for it. And there was articles like all over Pennsylvania, all over the US, even it reached as far as Europe as well.
Next up was John Curry. His trial set a new record for how fast it moved. Just 2 days. His lawyer barely touched on the witchcraft angle, instead arguing that Curry was a victim of neglect and abuse, pushed into this crime by the adults around him. I mean, Curry was only, 14?
14, yeah.
14 years old. At one point, he even turned to Curry's mother and told the jury, there is the person responsible for this boy being here today. The emotional moment wasn't enough to sway the jury. Like Blymire, John Curry was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. Wilbert Hess was the last to stand trial, and his lawyer knew he had an uphill battle. But then, during cross-examination, Wilbert Hess's mother revealed something crucial. When her son came home the morning after the murder, he told her, "Mother, I didn't want to go down there last night, and I didn't want to do what they made me do. But the man is dead. I hope you get better now." This was all Hess's lawyer needed. He spun the story into one of sacrifice. Hess had gone to Rehmeyer's Hollow not as a killer, but as a desperate son trying to save his family. He compared Hess's situation to the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, saying only in this case, God did not provide a substitute for the sacrifice. And it worked. Hess was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years. From start to finish, all 3 trials lasted only 6 days.
According to the York Daily Record and the author of Trials of Hex, which is a great book, by the way, and a resource I use for this, Curry, he served 10 years before his release. He then joined the US Army and was assigned to General Dwight D. Eisenhower's staff.
Wow.
And he helped draft the plans for the Normandy invasion and even designed the shoulder patch for D-Day.
Wow, seriously?
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Right? So after the war, he became a painter, something that he'd learned to do while he was in prison. And to this day, some homes in York County still display his work. He ended up dying at 49 in his home.
Oh.
Hess served
his... I guess. Right. Young age to die.
Right. Hess served his sentence. He returned to his family in Leader Heights, Pennsylvania, and he worked as a chain electroplater until his retirement in 1970. He died in 1978 at the age of 68, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. Blymire now. So he was released in 1953 on his 5th appeal, having served 23 years of his life sentence. He moved to Philadelphia, where he worked as an apartment house manager until his death in 1977. What's interesting though, after his release, he visited his brother, and after a 45-minute conversation, his brother remarked that man would do the same thing today. No change, no remorse.
Oh, he's like a real Malleus Maleficarum over here. All witches must be killed.
Right, yeah. So interestingly, there is speculation that Blymire, he may have actually been involved in another murder a year before Nelson's.
Ooh.
In 1927, 16-year-old Gertrude Rudy was found dead on the railroad tracks, shot at close range with a shotgun. Now, she was unmarried and pregnant, and after a doctor refused to help her, police believe that she may have turned to powwow as a last resort. When investigators learned that Blymire lived nearby, he worked in the same cigar factory as Rudy, attended her funeral, and was practicing witchcraft at the time. He became the prime suspect. But there just wasn't enough evidence to arrest him at the time. Funny enough, the same detective who later arrested Blymire for Nelson's murder had also been investigating Rudy's case. But yeah, unfortunately her murder, it still remains unsolved to this day.
Alright. So the Hex murder in York County sent shockwaves through the state, drawing intense media coverage and fueling a growing hysteria around folk magic. While local authorities didn't make any formal moves against powwowers, the press and officials in other parts of Pennsylvania took a different stance. Sensational headlines painted all practitioners, no matter how harmless their healing work, as dangerous witches. Readers across the country were stunned to learn that such beliefs still thrived in the modern world, and soon folk magic became synonymous with superstition and crime. Doctors, educators, and law enforcement officials began actively working to stamp out what they saw as dangerous occult practices. Any unexplained death with even the slightest connection to a powwower was suddenly labeled a hex murder. During the Rehmeyer trial, York County Coroner L.V. Zach publicly claimed that 5 children had died in the past 2 years because their parents took them to folk healers instead of licensed doctors. He admitted there had been no formal investigation into these cases, just whispers and rumors, but that didn't stop newspapers from running with the story. The New York Times even published an article with the chilling headline, "Death of 5 Babies Laid to Witch Cult." The York County Medical Society even went further, insisting that the coroner's estimate was much too low. We're talking about maybe 1 million babies.
No, I have no proof, but I'm sure.
Yeah. It wasn't long before new cases started emerging. In March 1929, a young woman named Verna Delp was found dead in the woods near Allentown. She carried 3 pieces of paper inscribed with magical charms, protection spells against murder and theft. A coroner's report found 3 poisons in her body, suggesting she had ingested them herself. When police discovered she had been seeing a powwower named Charles T. Bells, they immediately suspected another hex murder. Bells was arrested, even though he insisted he'd only been treating her for eczema. As the case unfolded, it was later revealed that Verna had been pregnant and possibly searching for a way to end her pregnancy. Despite this, the authorities remained fixated on Bells. With no real evidence linking him to the crime, he was still charged, held in jail for weeks, and only freed after a judge granted him bail. Verna Delp's murder has never been solved.
And this pattern, it continued. In January 1930, in Reading, Pennsylvania, housewife Mrs. Harriet MacDonald, she died from severe burns after reportedly using an ointment prescribed by a powwower. When her brother speculated, without proof, that a mixture had been flammable, the press seized on the idea. For weeks, lurid headlines claimed that she'd been victim of these occult practices gone wrong. 2 years later, on January 20th, 1932, Philadelphia accountant Normand Bechtel, he was found brutally murdered under a tree in Germantown. He'd been stabbed 9 times in the chest, and his wounds, they were arranged in a circular pattern. His attacker had cut crescent-shaped slashes into his forehead and a deep vertical wound down his face as well. So at first glance, it seemed like a robbery. His valuables were missing and his bloodstained car was abandoned miles away. But the ritualistic markings, it just set off alarm bells. So detectives, they speculated that they might have occult significance. And when they discovered Bechtel had grown up in Pennsylvania Dutch community where powwowing was common, the press, once again, jumped on the idea that another hex murder had happened. Investigators, they'd scoured his apartment for evidence of folk magic but found only Mennonite books and religious pamphlets. Years later, in 1937, William Jordan, he'd confessed that he and 4 others had killed Bechtel in a blackmail scheme. The murder had nothing to do with witchcraft, but by then the damage had already been done by the press.
Giving them a bad name.
Right.
So despite the lack of real evidence, fear of hexes continued to grow. In 1934, Pennsylvania was rocked by one final and undeniable hex murder. On March 17, 1934, a shotgun blast tore through the living room window of Susan Mummy's home in Pottsville, Schuylkill County, killing the 63-year-old woman in front of her adopted daughter. The attack was so sudden that those inside the house hid in fear for hours, believing the shooter might still be waiting outside. It wasn't until morning that their boarder, Jacob Rice, made the trip to town to report the crime. Now, at first, authorities assumed the killing was part of a personal feud, but the case took a strange turn when 24-year-old Albert Shinsky confessed. He claimed that Susan Mummy had hexed him 7 years earlier, leaving him unable to work and tormented by visions of a black cat with glowing eyes that would creep into his room at night. He had sought out powwowers for help, but nothing had worked, so finally he took to the shotgun. The only way, as we know from The Evil Dead, the only way to deal with a witch.
That's it, right?
Desperate, he killed Mummy, and the moment she died, he swore the curse was lifted from him. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, and once again the media framed the case as a battle between civilization and superstition. But doctors found Shinsky legally insane, and instead of execution, he was sent to Fairview State Hospital, where he remained for decades. By then, belief in powwow had become a serious liability. Schools in Pennsylvania began actively working to stamp out belief in hexes, hoping to replace folklore with modern medicine and science. State officials cracked down on powwowers, arresting them for practicing medicine without a license, and public opinion had turned. What was once seen as harmless folk healing was now feared and shunned. Still, powwowing, it's never really gone. Some healers continued their work quietly, tending to those who sought them out, while others abandoned the practice entirely. Though the fear of hexes faded, Pennsylvania's folk magic tradition never truly died. Even today, remnants of the old ways persist, passed down in whispers by those who still believe in the power of the craft. Now today, Nelson Rehmeyer's house still stands, nestled deep in what locals call Hex Hollow. Though empty, it hasn't been forgotten. Rehmeyer's descendants and the property's new owners have been working to turn it into a museum, preserving both his life and the infamous murder that took place within its walls. Much of the home remains untouched, still furnished with Rehmeyer's original belongings. In the kitchen, a section of the floor has been covered with glass, revealing the scorched floorboards beneath, the exact spot where Blymire tried to set the fire. Locals say the place is haunted. Shadowy figures have been spotted around the property when no one else is there. Some claim that if you throw pebbles at the house, it'll throw them right back at you. And disembodied voices have been recorded in the surrounding woods. And a black dog with glowing red eyes, a well-known omen of death, has been seen roaming the land. Some believe the house itself carries a curse, refusing to burn despite being made of wood that should have gone up in flames. Whether it's superstition or something more, one thing is certain. The Hollow has never let go of its past. And that's the story of the Hex Hollow murder.
It's so good.
That's such a fun story. Yeah, I like it. It's a good one. It's creepy, it's spooky, it's murderous. It's got it all. It's my favorite type of story.
Yeah.
Wow. We should bring back powwowing.
First of all, I love the word powwow. It reminds me of the Power Rangers.
It's a fun word.
Right? I mean, you could get a group of powwows together. Go, go, powwow, wowers. That's amazing.
That's great. It sounds like, just a great time.
Right?
Yeah. I kind of want to bring it back. I might look at this PDF and print it out and just start. I'm going to
Give it a glance over.
I'm not going to doctors ever again. I got it all right here. Look, security against mad dogs. Dog, hold thy nose to the ground. God has made me and thee, hound. That's what you heard me say. To cure the bite of a snake. God has created all things, and they were good. Thou only, serpent, art damned. Cursed be thou and thy sting. Zing, zing, zing. This sounds like dialogue from The Witch, Robert Eggers' The Witch, isn't it? And I am all for it.
I love it. That's great.
Yeah. Wow, this is great, folks. You guys got to read this. All right, well, that's today's episode of the That Chapter podcast, folks. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Yeah, I loved it. It was great. More of those, please.
Yeah, more of those. All right, and as always, if you've ever any suggestions, please send them in. Or if you've got your listener stories, you know what? Send them in as well. But until the next whole episode, every Monday, please take care of each other and yourselves.
And I'll see you.
All right. Thanks, folks. Bye.